Today we have Slobodan Sudaric, who works on the mentor team at cLabs and is really focused on looking at how to build Mentor 2.0 and how to really create more robust stability mechanisms for Celo stable assets. And we also have Layer Zero from MakerDao, who is focused on expanding sort of, stable assets within the legal context. So thank you, welcome, and thank you for joining this panel. I'm really excited to kind of deep dive into how we actually define robustness and how we can explore robustness from multiple facets of the stability protocol. Do you guys want to give a little bit of an intro about what you guys do, where you're from, and how you guys got into stable assets and what excites you about it?
Sure, thank you for the invitation, and very honored to be here in this Celo event. My name is Layer Zero, I work for MakerDao. My role at MakerDao is on the legal area. I have a legal background, but I am not the legal counsel, as MakerDao is fully decentralized and we have no legal counsel. My role is to implement strategies for mitigating legal risks for MakerDao and for improving the resiliency, the legal resiliency of the protocol. So that includes a bunch of projects that I would comment, and yeah, like in the area of legal tech, and organizational design.
Thank you. And Slobodan, do you want to give a little bit of an intro of what you do?
Sure, yeah, great to be here. I'm Slobodan. For those of you who do not know me, I work at cLabs in the Mentor team. Within Mentor, I'm working primarily on collateral, reserve composition, and generally the question on how to back stable assets. I have a background in economics, and so the jump from economic thinking in terms of incentives and mechanism design towards stablecoins is not so big, and this is also what excited me about stablecoins.
Nice, thank you for sharing that. I think this panel is super timely given the markets that we're in, which is very different from like at least a quarter ago or a quarter and a half ago. And what was really interesting about the way this bear market kind of turned out was the onset of a decentralized stablecoin essentially collapsing, which is why this conversation is very interesting to have, right? It's almost like we are responding and adapting to kind of the flaws, or sort of the flaws that basically arise within the mechanisms that are in place in our market. When we're thinking about robustness, and even before we go into robustness, can we kind of have a quick summary as to like how MakerDAO's stability mechanisms work and how that's different from like Celo's stable assets and Celo's stability mechanism, and then maybe we can go into like how is robustness defined in both scenarios?
Sure. So in a nutshell, MakerDao is an over-collateralized stablecoin. So basically how it works is Maker is a protocol for issuing stablecoins. Basically, each user can come to MakerDao, to a Maker Vault, and can have a credit, and this credit is denominated in the stablecoin DAI. When you take out new debt, new DAI is issued. When you pay back your debt, the DAI is burned. So basically, that's how it works. It's everything collateralized. So we have around 50 different collaterals. Each one has its own risk parameters, like stability fee, that is the interest rate that you pay, and other risk parameters. And yeah, that's in a nutshell how it works. It is self-custodial, so the user always have control. MakerDao has no control on the collateral. And it's basically, yeah, it's like maybe this meme like the decentral bank, or I don't know. I do not like very much this meme, but basically it is a metaphor to explain. So it's a decentralized protocol for issuing decentrally stablecoin.
Nice, thank you. And Slobodan, do you want to kind of give a quick summary?
Sure. So maybe two key differences probably is that Mentor currently supports 3 different stablecoins. So there is $1 tracking, 1 euro tracking, and 1 tracking the Brazilian real. And the way how it works is not borrow and repay as in DAI or in Maker, but a buy and sell mechanism. So you can buy a new stablecoin from a reserve essentially, and then those assets that you provide are essentially held on chain. I think this is where we share a lot of similarities. Like the reserves are fully on chain, fully transparent, fully collateralized. But yeah, I think that's the 2 key differences.
So when it comes to the fact that both of these stablecoins are decentralized, what sort of robustness checks do you guys have in place, or how do you define robustness? Like when you are testing, like the robustness of your stable assets.
Right. So for us, robustness is a key feature. I would say resiliency is probably a better word to describe it, and we see it at 3 different layers. The first layer is at a protocol level, at the technical layer. At that layer, we double down on decentralization and permissionlessness. So if we need to implement a feature, and we have the choice between this permissionless feature or another one that requires or a trust or assumes trust on some agent or some other agents, like for example Multisig, we should always prefer the permissionless version. And also double down on decentralization. We have this decentralization metrics where we measure different aspects, technical governance, many others of the protocol, and we try to decentralize or to identify centralization points of failure and mitigate or eliminate them. So that's the first layer, or a protocol layer. The second layer is at an organizational level, at the DAO. That is less about technical features, it's about how the organization is structured. And in that way, MakerDao is, like probably many of you already know, is fully decentralized in its operations. There was this Maker Foundation who ran the project. It was dissolved. They had an entity in Cayman Island. They were dissolved already. And since last year, we have been spinning off what we call core units. And core units are autonomous groups of teams that are decentralized and spread out throughout the world and carry different options, operate the protocol, like marketing, risk, governance, legal, everything what an organization needs. There are currently a lot of interesting discussions, strategic discussions going on in MakerDao, how to develop this structure for improving its resiliency. And basically, the discussions are leading to a structure where we have a core MakerDao, very simplistic, automatized, fast ossified, like a Bitcoin type of protocol that sits in the center that is totally unstoppable. And then we have an ecosystem of MetaDAOs or sub-DAOs that are related to the main DAO, but that carry out more complex and more risky things, like, for example, legal, or, for example, all the real-world finance deals that are extremely complex and risky should be developed in the future by MetaDAOs or sub-DAOs that are, like, outsourced from the core. So if they have compromised, then we isolate and outsource this type of risk. And the third layer of robustness or resiliency is at a personal level. So we find that if the main legal risk that we have at working at DAOs, which is, in my opinion, liability risk, because we don't have a legal wrapper, a legal entity around the project. So we have the risk that we could be considered as a general partnership, which in legalese means that every person could be held liable for all the liabilities of the project. That is a theoretical risk. We haven't had court decisions on that yet, but we have 2 cases recently in the US that the plaintiffs argued exactly that one person could be held liable for all the liabilities of the project. So for that, we have a bunch of projects, and one of them is an insurance project. And we are setting up a self-insurance fund. It's like a legal defense fund where if somebody is sued, then this fund should pay the legal cost of defense. And that is a first layer of protection. And then after that, there are a couple of very interesting blockchain native insurance protocols, which we could like make work together with the self-insurance fund. So the idea is that we mitigate as much as we can liability risks of the contributors, of the governors, and also users of the system. For us, it's important that, very important, the topic consumer protection and risks that DAI users have, or vault owners, those are like the 2 main type of users. They should also be protected by some type of insurance, a comprehensive risk management strategy. So those are like the 3 layers that we think about what does it mean robustness, technical, organizational, and like personal liability.
Thank you. When you mentioned from the organizational level, like over time you do see sort of these autonomous guilds becoming like MetaDAOs and sub-DAOs, and you obviously want to coordinate like some sort of participation when it comes to like the decentralization governance of the stable assets that you have in place. Like, what are those key challenges that you foresee that MakerDAO as a whole would have to navigate, or these sub-DAOs and MetaDAOs together would have to navigate, and how do you really align those communities?
One of the key risks that we have, and MakerDAO is not the only one, is a low participation in governance, which make the project vulnerable for governance attacks. So there are a couple of projects going on to implement tokenomics to incentivize participation and like generating one ideas to have like sort of like similar like the curve, like a V curve tokens where they there's some type of incentives to lock up the tokens so they are locked up in governance and make the project more resilient. So I would say that for the governance part, that is one risk, big risk that we have, low participation rate. And the other risk, the other issue that we have is the project, it is a DAO. We don't have central management. And now with the market downturn, revenues are decreasing. So there are a lot of discussions going on how to deal with that, if we have to run a deficit for a time, or we have to cut down costs and fire people and shut down teams. So this strategic discussion is going on, and without a central leadership, it is a challenge. But yeah, but we are having this type of discussions in the DAO, and yeah, figuring out how to execute them together.
That's really great to know, and honestly, it's also refreshing that you are being so transparent about these challenges, right? That a decentralized organization faces, which I feel like are way more than what a centralized org faces. Slobodan, when it comes to Celo stable assets and the Mentor protocol, of course, like one of the key features that you guys are working on is again that community participation piece. How do you guys again like define robustness, right, within Celo and Celo stable assets, and then how are you working with this low participation risk as well, or do you see that as one of the main risks that we have within the Celo ecosystem?
Yeah, great question. So, we thought a lot about robustness in terms of aligning incentives. For example, we rely a lot on market incentives when it comes to keeping the peg, essentially, and expanding and contracting stablecoins that are issued already. And we realized that incentives work probably 95% of the time, but in 5% of the time they don't really work well. And the 5% of the time may be a time where it actually matters. And I used to work in power and electricity market design, and I like to draw this analogy that you don't want to rely on market incentives for a power plant to shut on when you need it. You essentially pay for backup capacity and make sure that it's there when you need it. And this is a bit how we think about aligning incentives in the long run to have committed parties. There is I'm not sure if Marcus mentioned this, there is this idea of interaction providers who essentially lock funds, who essentially run certain trades on the protocol that keep the overall stability fixed. So one is really, committing incentives in the long run to make this entire system more robust. And I think the other big area that we're thinking about is collateral. And I know Maker is also doing a lot in this space. I think whenever you use crypto assets as collateral, you have this problem, or as an economist would say, this market inefficiency that whenever volatility goes upwards, you are highly collateralized. You have collateral that you essentially do not need. Whereas if volatility goes downwards, you are in trouble. And what you would love to do is take collateral from the good state of the world and transfer it to the bad state of the world, essentially. And what you can do in real markets is essentially buy insurance, right? You buy an insurance product, or in financial markets, you would buy like a out of the money option, essentially, that gives you some downward protection. In DeFi, this doesn't really exist yet. And so currently we're thinking a lot in terms of how to make this risk transfer, essentially.
And you're thinking on risks of the user of the system?
Yes.
So how to transfer risk from users of the system to another stakeholder that could cover this part, for example, in this case, volatility risk if the position is liquidated.
Exactly right. You would essentially pay collateral providers, for example, a participation fee. They take on the risk. They are willingly taking on the risk, and they might be left in a position where they lose some funds, but that's fine. They signed up for it. The key part is that a stablecoin user shouldn't have any risk, or as little risk as possible. So this consumer protection aspect that you also mentioned is, I think, one key concept that we're thinking about.
That could be like a token-based system? Or simply buying insurances and transferring the risk to an outside party?
I think how to incentivize this that's a great question. I mean, there are probably different ways how to do this, but You could think of this as an LP token, but it's not an LP token, but a CP token in a way. But you can tokenize this. Yeah.
Let's exchange ideas, because I find this this area for us very, very important to develop mechanism for transferring risk. And yeah, so we share common issues.
Great.
That's awesome. And when it comes to, you both have talked about this idea of insurance, right, and essentially transferring the risk. Of course, you can tokenize and quantify that risk and incentivize people to basically take on that risk. But when it comes to the collateral itself, like how do we, are there certain types of collaterals that can essentially mitigate this risk as well, or that basically in the long term can reduce the amount of risk that the user kind of holds on to? And I know MakerDao, you guys have launched like a really awesome program with one of the banks, institutional banks, where essentially the banks receive a DAI loan that is collateralized with real-world assets. So can you kind of talk a little bit more about that program? And then I'd love to like get your thoughts on, you know, how do we go about the collateral piece as well?
Sure. So MakerDao decided probably 2 years ago to expand to real-world assets, to start accepting real-world assets as collateral for DAI issuance.
So can you define what's like a real-world asset? Is it like property, like, you know, if you go to a regular bank, like, you know, your mortgage or, yeah,
it could be,
your car?
theoretical. Yeah, it could be everything possible. Right now, like one of the big projects with SocGen, the third largest bank in France, are tokenized bonds. They ask for a credit line of 20 million, and they have a structure. Of course, it is a very complex that requires like a lot of legal engineering. And requires the setup of the different legal vehicles in different parts of the world to manage the assets, to transfer the funds, to exchange DAI for fiat currency, and so on and so forth. So there are, this is a very experimental and very complex area, not uncontroversial. So when this decision was taken, almost there was like a division in the project. There was a part of the community that believed that Maker should remain like pure crypto, pure collateral. There was another part of the project that saw the community that thought, no, we have the purpose that these organizations should have is to serve the world and serve the real world economy. I adhere to this vision. But it brings also a lot of risk to the project, because each of these projects expose Maker to specific regulation, to specific countries. So that's why this idea of dividing the project between a core minimalistic DAO and MetaDAOs that do not belong to the core but have legal entities around them and other type of liability protection mechanism that are not part of the core. If something bad happens, if it is compromised, one of these deals, one of these projects, then the main project is not compromised. It is important for diversifying risk, because real-world finance assets normally are not that correlated with crypto assets. So that is important. So it diminishes this risk in this sense, because it diversifies the collateral basket. But on the other hand, it increases also a lot of risk, or exposes the project to a lot of risk. So there are now currently some projects going on, experimental structures. And I think when these are tried out, when SocGen is tried out and other ones in other parts of the world, then we could have like a template where we could like use the structure for other similar deals. But until now, it's an experimental stage, and SocGen is now very advanced actually in the structuring process. But it have been taken years to structure these projects in a compliant way.
I definitely really resonate with that because, well, first of all, like, you know, it's all about getting low crypto loans and decentralized stable assets in the hands of everyday folks. And that's kind of what always attracted me to Celo. But also recently, my pilots team, we were able to go to Nairobi and do like an under-collateralized lending pilot. And it was just really interesting to see, as you mentioned, like what is the collateral really? Like in this case, yes, of course, like in the employer-based lending model that we tried out, financially, the employer posted up like collateral for the employees to take out loans, but the other collateral was also like the relationship and the trust that the employer and the employee had. And so how do you really quantify that? So I think that's really interesting that there's a lot of opportunities for, you know, infrastructure, such as even credit scoring, and as you mentioned, like, you know, quantifying that risk, quantifying that insurance that you have in place. So when it comes to Celo as well, and we're thinking about like real-world collateral. Of course, nature-backed capital is a big kind of move for us since we're really focused and uncommitted to ReFi. What types of nature-backed capital assets would make sense in terms of like creating a robust sort of mechanism for stable assets?
Yeah. So I would say when Maker is considering real-world assets in more general, we are probably considering a subset of real-world assets that generate an impact that we want to see, a protection of natural resources, for example, and the asset type could really be quite different, to be honest. We started with carbon credits because they are available, they are easy tradable. I mean, there are ledger entries in the first place, and whether they're in a distributed ledger or off-chain doesn't really matter. But we are slowly considering more complex assets, and this could go into loans, into more structured products like bonds, or even outright ownership. But as you said, it's there is a certain trade-off in terms of complexity. Probably even a trade-off between complexity and impact. So you could imagine there is a piece of forest that is about to be cut down, right? The maximum impact you can have is buy the land and protect the forest, but purchasing land is not that easy, as you can imagine. It also raises a couple of problems around liquidity, obviously. You have the same thing with loans, because you tie up your capital for some time, and sure, you get interest over time. This is good. But if you need the capital essentially at a certain time in between, then you are, what would you do? You need to liquidate the loan portfolio, for example. But in terms of robustness, I think it's not the most important aspect, because, as you said, the correlation to crypto assets more broadly is much, much lower. And when we are thinking about real-world assets, we literally have the whole world essentially as liquidity, right? It's not only on-chain liquidity. It's just that transaction times are often like slower, essentially. That's the limiting factor.
And when it comes to like, again, this implementation aspect of like impact, right? Like, would you say like we still have a long way to go when it comes to MRV and sort of like these verification metrics that we have in place, or verification infrastructure that we have in place as well? Because these assets are relatively also illiquid. Like when you have a rainforest, you can't just cut it down and liquidate like a forest on demand.
Yeah, I think the entire topic of MRV, so monitoring, reporting, and verification, essentially, this is really something where Web3, I think, can improve the the status quo so much. I think this is really where Web3 will shine in that space. Right now, for example, when it comes to carbon credits, we are essentially relying on established registries, so Vera, Gold Standard, and so on, because we essentially trust that they do the job. It's probably not ideal, but it's currently what we have. And going forward, I think this would be an area where, more innovation would just be fantastic in that space. And I know that guys from Climate Collective are here. They're actively working on this.
Absolutely. Well, with 5 minutes left, I do want to give the chance for the audience to ask you guys some questions. So in the last 30 seconds, I mean, we've talked a lot about how do we define robustness within both the MakerDao ecosystem and the Celo ecosystem, how we're able to transfer risk from the end user to basically the governance members and like essentially the protocol, right? And use sort of different incentive mechanisms, and then what type of risks are basically in play as well, like the collateral risk, kind of the infrastructure that we need to assess this risk to get the right type of data. So what is it, when it comes to robustness, like what is one thing that you want the audience to take away from this conversation?
I want to invite the audience to use our products. Our purpose in this world is we want to build a better currency for the world. We want to build, the purpose of our organization is to build a currency that is uncensorable, that is not manipulable by central banks or governments. We live in convoluted times. We live in times where we may have a large political conflict. We live in times where the United States is decaying as world empire, and probably the US currency as world reserve currency will also decay. And we have the chance with blockchain technologies and with DeFi and with decentralized stablecoins. The value prop of decentralized stablecoins is to bring financial sovereignty to the individual, is to give us better assets, to give us financial sovereignty and independence, and these kind of values are very important. And that's why our products are very well known in developing countries. We share a lot of values with the Celo ecosystem. In places where I come from, South America, like Venezuela or Argentina, places with hyperinflation, we see a large demand for products like DAI. So like we live in times of high inflation, and inflation is a tax on the population, especially the poor population. So we want to bring an alternative for that. And our systems are not risk-free, are experimental, but we are working out strategies for developing robustness and resiliency. We are still very early, and yeah, it is a community effort, and wherever you are in the world, then promote our systems, promote our products, because that is really an important mission that we have in this world, and especially in this historic moment.
It's amazing. Yes, self-sovereignty all the way. Slobodan, what is one thing you want the audience to take away from this panel when we're especially talking about robustness?
It's hard to make like a better conclusion than that, but let me try. I think when we think about robustness, we should really think in terms of user perspective and like robustness when it comes to the user. So a stablecoin user shouldn't, be facing any risk, ideally. The risk should just be transferred somewhere else. And I think what we've seen in the past, the industry didn't really deliver on that promise. And I think going forward, we just need to make sure that this works. And I think this is also basically in line with what upcoming regulation, for example, is trying to achieve. And so a lot of aligned incentives essentially there.
Absolutely. I would like to open the floor up to the audience for the next 2 minutes. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so first of all, great presentation. I'm a big fan of what Celo's doing. I do have some concerns about the mentor reserve. So on the website, it says 6% BTC, 6% ETH, 18% DAI. So it's a two-part question. So first of all, I'm pretty sure DAI is also backed by BTC and ETH. So that's also just pretty much BTC and ETH as well. And then the second part of the question, my bigger concern is the mentor reserve is backed by 50% Celo. Celo reserve, like Celo organization mints Celo itself. So backing a stablecoin by the same currency you created itself is sort of like almost like a Luna situation, right? It kind of creates a circular dependency. So like, why is that not a concern, and how do you mitigate that risk?
Alexi, do you want to take it, or? Oh, no. I'm good. So I think there are a couple of points to point out here. So Celo is minted by block rewards, right? Like in any other blockchain. So the mentor, the stability protocol, cannot mint any Celo into existence. It's a fixed amount that is in there, and we can change the allocation over time, but it's not this situation where you can essentially hyperinflate your collateral in a way. On the numbers, I'm actually not sure if they are accurate. This might have been a glitch because as far as I remember, DAI is, I think, 20% in the reserve, something like this. And sure, DAI is, well, you can talk more about this, like partly backed by ETH, partly backed by USDC. I think actually more than half is USDC in essence. And the rest is, I don't know, BTC.
Yeah, ETH, but USDC, unfortunately, we have now a large over-dependency on USDC. Yeah. But the rest is ETH. I don't have numbers off the top of my head, but maybe 20% ETH, 70-something USDC currently. So we have, currently that's our largest risk, I think, the over-dependency on USDC.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it would help to explain why DAI is, for example, in there in the first place. So the idea was really to go towards low volatility assets, right? And then your choices are already limited. And then I think what we with the recent CGP also decided on is to add even some diversification on the low volatility assets, which is why we went for a 50-50 split between USDC and DAI. And sure, DAI is also backed by some other stuff, but it's a hedging point essentially.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Such an amazing panel.
Thank you for the invitation.
Please give a hand for these guys, because this was a very complex panel, but very much needed.